Everything immediately surrounding her, the boring countryside, the idiotic bourgeois people, the mediocrity of everyday life, seemed to her an exception in the world, something she had fallen into by accident, while beyond all this the realm of bliss and passion stretched forth as far as the eye could see. In her longing she confused the pleasures of luxury with the joys of the heart, elegant customs with refined feelings. Those words are from Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, and I think in this podcast I'd like to discuss some of the Miltonian elements that exist in some of the writers that came after him. But first, we do have to get into books 7 and 8, and we have to start talking about what happens here. Book 7 narrates the creation of the heavens and the earth and all the animals and mankind. I think we can get through this pretty quickly, but there are a few things that pertain to the themes that we've been talking about. One of those themes being what effect it is having on Adam and Eve. The mere fact that they're supposed to be restricted from knowledge, and yet Raphael is informing them all about good and evil. And I think it's interesting, line 56. So this is after they've just heard about the war in heaven. The evil soon driven back redounded as a flood on those from whom it sprung. That's line 56. Sort of that's the conclusion. The war in heaven is over. And Adam, this is Milton. This is part of the narration. So this is Milton talking. Line 59. Adam soon repealed the doubts that in his heart arose. He's been given doubts after hearing this story. So this seems to be Milton confirming the fact that there's a little danger here in Raphael telling him all these things. Thank God, Adam soon repealed the doubts that in his heart arose, and now led on, yet sinless, with desire to know what nearer might concern him. So for Milton to put it this way, that he's led on, yet sinless, with desire to know, it's sort of like you could interpret this to think that there's an in spite of that's between the lines here. Despite the fact that he is still sinless, you might wonder, like as though the reader should be wondering why this innocent person is so curious. So Adam still wants to know more. Line 84, he's asking Raphael, relate what may no less perhaps avail us, known. Avail, interesting choice of words. But the whole sentence seems to say that, all right, well, if you were okay relating us to war in heaven, I mean, what else can we not know? That's how I think I'm free to interpret it that way. You just told us all about Satan. What can't we know if we can know that? Also, the use of the word avail. Relate what may no less perhaps avail us. Known. As though that first story is not going to avail us. It's as though that Adam is suggesting that he already knows they're going to fall and that none of this is going to avail them anyway. So why don't you tell us something else that's going to fail to prevent our fall? So Raphael starts. Raphael, line 116. What can make them happier shall not be withheld by hearing, he says. So he's conceding here that knowledge can bring some happiness, which has a few implications. The obvious ones, the things we've been talking about. The idea that we're not satisfied with being ignorant. We want to know. That part's easy enough. But there's also something more to this. To say that he must impart knowledge, or that he's willing to impart knowledge in order to make them happier, and that he shall not withhold things that are deemed safe enough to relate to them in order to make them happier. It seems to be acknowledging that the bliss of Eden is going to be amended further. It's an ongoing work. So they're not in a perfect state of happiness. Their happiness is supposed to be maintained and improved upon. Seems kind of interesting. Line 119, to answer thy desire of knowledge within bounds, Raphael says. Within bounds, he'll answer for the desire of knowledge, as in there are things I won't tell you, there are things I will tell you. So far, we haven't figured out what he won't tell them. That is coming, though. So he's going to tell them about the earth. He's going to tell them about the earth. To create the earth, God dispatches his, this is line 165, overshadowing spirit and might. Two entities. An overshadowing spirit and might. So is this once again God delegating and not actually doing anything himself? And also, line 167, it says that God includes heaven in what is to be created. Create the heavens and earth and define the boundaries. So heaven still needs to be created. Where has all this been taking place? Where did the war in heaven just take place? Isn't heaven already in existence? And yet again, throughout this book, we see Satan was correct in referring to the minstrelsy of heaven. Everything God does, they just jump for joy. They're a bunch of kiss asses in heaven. He decides to create the earth, they start singing songs again. This line is interesting. Line 383 sounds a little bit like the American flag here. As he's creating the heavens and earth, with thousand stars that then appeared spangling the hemisphere. Well, it sounds like the American flag. So then we get language regarding the tree, line 542. But of the tree which tasted works knowledge of good and evil. So he's explaining to them, and he tells them after that, if you eat from the tree of good and evil, that you're going to die. I think it's interesting the way he says this, works knowledge of good and evil. And I have to admit that the fact that this is in here kind of goes against what I've been saying. I've been saying that it pertains more to knowledge, but here they're including good and evil as being a big part of it. But here's how I will interpret this line. Because the word works is in here, I see this as that as innocent beings in their ignorant state of bliss, that Adam and Eve don't really know right from wrong in their innocence, and so their actions are incapable of being the product of an evil intent. And that's why he says works knowledge. The tree which tasted works knowledge of good and evil, which means once you eat from it, your actions are governed by an appreciation for what is good and what is evil. And once they eat from the tree, they can no longer conduct themselves unknowingly, and that they may be ascribed right or wrong for their actions. So in a sense, there's no morality in Eden except for the tree. They're allowed to do anything else. They can do whatever they want, and they will remain sinless. Any deed that we may think of as wrong, they're allowed to commit. I never really thought about it that way, but that's kind of what they're saying. So book 7, I think we can move on, and let's move into book 8. So now that we get into the idea of science and the idea of pursuing knowledge in a much more scientific sense, and Adam puts it like this in line 25, reason I oft admire, how nature wise and frugal could commit such disproportions with superfluous hand, so many nobler bodies to create. Okay, this is what he's saying when he's talking about looking up at the stars. How could a wise nature be bothered to create all this? Can you please explain this to me? Why is it all there? It seems like our portion is very small, but nature created something huge. Can you please elaborate on this? Raphael. Raphael's response, line 72. Well, the great architect did wisely to conceal and not divulge his secrets to be scanned by them who ought rather admire. So basically, Raphael, don't you worry about it. Your job is to admire it, not to understand it. Line 76. He his fabric of the heavens hath left to their disputes, perhaps to move his laughter. This is an important line, I think. This is kind of God mocking the scientist, mocking the people who want to understand why things happen, want to understand the sciences, and that God leaves them to their disputes, perhaps to move his laughter, that he's laughing at them. Raphael continues in line 170, joy thou in what he gives to thee, this paradise and fair Eve. Heaven is for thee too high to know what passes there. Be lowly wise, and think only what concerns thee and thy being. Dream not of other worlds. and what creatures there live. Um, there had been a line earlier that I skipped. It's almost like Milton has contemplated the idea that there could be aliens in other worlds. There's a line, Satan passes other worlds. I think it's in book 3. Whether or not there's life forms there, he doesn't look into. So Milton contemplates the idea of aliens earlier, but I think this is more creatures in other worlds. I think this is more referring um, to the angels. Can we? So I'm now. I kind of want to start talking about Goethe and Flaubert and Dickens. But first of all, let's talk about some of Milton's own hypocrisy. Does Milton ascribe by his own advice? Don't dream about other worlds. How can we consider that Milton does anything other than dream about other worlds? How would he have conceived of anything in this poem? So must he be a hypocrite to even say this? I think this is there's something that kind of pervades literature. It's never the main theme, but it's always either a sub-theme or it's an undercurrent of the mind that thinks that it is complex, envies the minds that are simpler. That, or there's something else at work here that is peculiar. Well, actually not peculiar to Milton, but exists in a lot of writers, which is to sort of lionize a certain class of human being while clearly not thinking yourself to be one of them. Because, like I said, Milton doesn't follow his own advice. Milton doesn't think that he needs to restrict his mind. His mind is being visited by a muse and being shown all these things. What do you think he must think of himself? That he must be thinking of himself more like an angel. He's allowed to see the privileged view, but the average person, no, they probably shouldn't be. Because like he says, line 180, 188, apt the mind or fancy is to rove, and of her roving is no end. So focus on daily life, he says. This is closer to line 193. To know that which before us lies in daily life is the prime wisdom. Now, again, there's no way Milton could possibly think he lives according to that principle. He clearly thinks about higher things. And there's one other line I want to get to here in Paradise Lost before we start talking about some other things, and that's line 103. Okay, that man may know he dwells not in his own, an edifice too large for him to fill. Okay, so Milton, while he himself is worthy of the angels, he himself is worthy of visitation from a muse, but other people aren't. So he kind of has this notion, if we're going to get into the kind of this philosophical relationship of the inner and outer man, which is an annoying concept to talk about when you're talking about literature, the power of the mind over the body, or the power of the body over the mind, that the philosopher attitude that Milton is taking is that there's a different balance to be sought for different people, and that ignorant people who belong in a kind of blue collar proletariat, well, we should honor the fact that they are willing to subdue their lofty thoughts and work. That's for them to find that balance, but it's for other people like Milton to strike a different balance. He's capable of being visited by this muse, so he doesn't apply the same rule to everybody else. So perhaps he has that in common with Calvin, as we had quoted earlier, that all people are not created on equal terms. And that kind of brings us back to what Homer had said in the Iliad. The Trojans emit a battle cry, the Greeks march in silence. But there's a later period where the Trojans are in mourning, and King Priam is nervous, and he wants them to keep their emotions in check. And this is a day after a large amount of suffering. And as Lessing points out, the great critic, playwright, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing had written in his book Laocoon, which I talked about earlier, that why should Priam, what is Homer saying? That Priam is worried that his men can't handle certain things. They have to keep their emotions in check, that they need to assert their own, the power of the body over the mind. They need to keep their emotions in check. They can't handle it. But the Greeks, their leader doesn't say anything similar. The Greeks are civilized, and part of their civilization means they are in control. They can be emotional. Remember what the line was in the beginning of Book 3 in the Iliad. Combat fury was beneath their silence. They were silent, but they were in control of a fury at the same time. So it seems to be Homer suggesting that some people can master it and some people can't. So for some people, there are things that they cannot handle. Why? Because as Milton tells us, line 188, as I had just read, apt the mind or fancy is to rove unchecked, and of her roving is no end. I think that's important. Also, the fact that he feminizes the mind is this roving, wandering entity that needs to be kept in check. And I think this is a great segue into a discussion of Madame Bovary. So the story of Madame Bovary takes place in the French countryside in the town of Yonville. And a pretty girl is married to someone who is not quite a doctor, but something less than that. But he functions as the doctor in this town. And she's not happy with her life. And we might ask if one of the reasons she's not happy is because apt is her mind or fancy to rove, just as Milton says. And does Flaubert say a lot of the same things as Milton? First of all, some of these descriptions are good enough to read without caring about any kind of inner meaning. So she's married to a husband she's not attracted to. You know, they're on a little day trip somewhere, and she's looking at her husband, and this is what she sees. His cap was pulled down to his eyebrows, and his thick lips were quivering, which added a certain stupidity to his face. Even his back, his placid back, was irritating to look at. It was as though she could see all his dullness spread across his coat. So she's looking at her own husband with utter disgust. And there are a lot of funny lines like that in this book. But here's something closer to what we've just heard about from Milton. Her carnal desires, her longing for money, and the melancholy of her unfulfilled passion merged into one vast anguish. And instead of trying to distract herself from it, she concentrated her attention on it, stirring up the pain and always looking for a chance to suffer. And she talks about the happiness that eluded her. Now, contrast that with when she's later on, someone from the French government comes to their town, and he praises a different kind of intelligence, a different kind of mind. Not good is and this is the quote, the superficial intelligence, which is nothing but the useless ornament of idle minds. No, I am speaking of that profound and moderate intelligence which applies itself above all to the pursuit of useful ends. Okay? The pursuit of useful ends. Milton had said in Paradise Lost, man may know he dwells not in his own an edifice too large for him to fill. And he had said between line 170 and 175, think only on what concerns thee. And then that other quote that I'd said between lines 190 and 195, to know that which before us lies in daily life is the prime wisdom. And he's saying, so is she not a Trojan? She can't handle this stuff. She's not in control of her roving mind. Madame Bovary isn't. So there's another line, and throughout that book, she gets annoying. The more she continues to cheat on her husband, and she has all these thoughts, all these discontented thoughts about how she was destined for more than she was given in life. And contrast that with Dickens. She needs a good talking to by Biddy, don't you think? And is Pip, in Great Expectations, just after Pip has been informed that he has this anonymous benefactor, Pip doesn't see it as a stroke of luck. He's like Madame Bovary. He thinks he was entitled to it. He thinks that all his lessons have paid off. Because he's always aspired to it, that means he deserved it when it came. And Joe Gargery, his good friend, the blacksmith who he grows up with, says it to him. This is from Great Expectations. The change came on uncommon plump, didn't it? Joe Gargery asks him. And Pip, thinking he deserved it, he wishes he would have said, "It does you credit, Pip." That's what he wanted to hear. That's what he wanted to hear. But Joe doesn't say it. Joe says, calls it like it is. It's a stroke of luck. It had nothing to do with anything you did. You're a little Madame Bovary. So Pip goes and talks to Biddy, thinking that he can get Biddy to agree with him. Joe should have improved himself. Now that Pip is going to be this great gentleman, and he's going to get everything that was coming to him in life. He talks to her and says, Joe should have been wanting to improve himself. Why doesn't Joe have lofty thoughts? Why isn't his mind apt to fancy and to rove? And Biddy says something to Pip that someone should have said to Madame Bovary. "Have you never considered that he may be proud?" she asks him. And Biddy says, "He may be too proud to let anyone take him out of a place that he is competent to fill, and fills well and with respect." Again, that line in Milton, "That man may know he dwells not in his own, an edifice too large for him to fill." That's Joe Gargery. Some people can handle it, some people can't. Joe Gargery can handle it. He's the Greek, marching in line, in silence. And he can suppress his fury. Pip? Nope. Pip can't handle it. And neither can Madame Bovary. But that's that. We're done with book 8, and we're on to Satan assuming the form of the serpent and entering the Garden of Eden.